Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm excited to be joined by Carrie Preston to talk all about the series Elsbeth. And one of the things that I love in your portrayal of this character is that I've heard you describe how you always try to think through what would the obvious choices in terms of reactions and responses be in playing her, and then working through those so that you can discard them and find something completely different. Because Elspeth isn't someone who makes the obvious choices. And I was interested in how, looking back 14 years ago, even with The Good Wife, you kind of started to find that nugget of it, but how you've been able to really lean so much further into that process throughout the series, Elspeth.
Yeah, when I first read the script, way back when, 15 years ago, uh, the I knew that she was a character that was going to be unconventional. I knew that she was going to be somebody who was not going to be connecting the dots the way everybody else around her was connecting the dots. That's why they bring her in, right? So she's got to have some kind of superpower. So what is that, And so I started kind of digging deep in there, and it was interesting because Robert King said way back then, we're thinking about her like a female Columbo. And so it's kind of amazing that 15 years later, that's basically what I'm doing on Elsbeth is, the following the lines of that unconventional detective. Um, and what I did was I started looking at what was happening in between the lines. You always start with what's on the page, right? So you do that, but because she was somebody who was so mercurial in her thinking, I was wondering, how did the synapses fire? When do they fire? How fast? How slow? And one of the writers wrote in the very first script the word pause, Pause, pause. I was like, okay, that's the key. Like, what's happening there? Let's fill that in and then see what that will bring for the rest of it. Now, the fact that the editors and the director and the producers let the pause happen um, was pretty rare, because in TV everything has to go clippity clip, right? You usually lose all the nuance because they're trying to cut to plot. So I just started filling that in, and then as the years went on and on, I started, the writers were seeing what I was doing, and we started just creating this wonderful alchemy between the writing and what I was bringing to it.
And I love that description of just really thinking about how the synapses are firing for her, because there's such a wonderful rhythm to this character. And I think you do such a great job at externalizing the thought process continuously. We can see the way that she's processing information around her. And I think it's such a challenge to externalize something that is so internal for the audience. And
Right.
what were some of the early challenges in just really finding all the different ways to do that and just finding a natural rhythm and cadence to it?
Yeah, yeah. I always think of that. I think of her as she's thinking one thing, she's saying another thing, and she's physically doing a third thing. So I, would start to map it out at the beginning when I was finding the character. I would map it out. I mean, I would write it out. I would map it out on the page, so that I knew it would become secondhand the more I kind of got into it. And I started you know, the way I work is, it's uh very much about the words, but it's also about, just the learning of them is a repetitive process for me. It's like rote. I have to just get it in my mouth and in my body. Um, and I do it alone. People are like, do you run lines with people? Do you do that? I can't. I have to do this by myself so that it becomes a second nature. So that those three things that are very different become second nature, so that when I show up on the day and another actor is throwing me something, I'm not doing what I rehearsed. I'm letting the choice happen based on what somebody is giving me. But because I have been profoundly prepared, it becomes second nature. And then new things can come out of that, things that surprise me. And that's where the fun of it happens. And because I've had the luxury of playing this character for so long and being given so many different opportunities, so many different scenarios to find her and refine her. Um, it it I'm able to really rest and rely on my instincts.
And the scripts for this show are so dialogue heavy, and especially for Elspeth, because she's always externalizing a monologue that's going on inside her head at the same time.
Yeah.
And I've heard you say that you kind of call it mission exposition in terms of the dialogue that
Yeah.
requires you to explain what's happening to the audience, but make it feel very natural. And
Yeah.
how did you set about when you first were playing her, and particularly having to give so much exposition in this series, really figure out the nuances of that?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I do a lot more of that on Elsbeth than I did on The Good Wife and The Good Fight, primarily because I wasn't the main character on those shows. I was always just showing up to, serve that main story and those main characters. And because the structure of this show is quite different than those shows, um, it's very much in the old school tradition of the good detective drama. And that, if you look at Columbo, I mean, he would have these epic monologues where he would be summing up the crime for the criminal right in front of them and realizing how, their one fatal flaw, got them caught. And so I really embrace those. I mean, they're really challenging to learn because for television, usually the norm is usually you have like a page, maybe a half a page, quarter of a page. The scenes are short. In this show, I've got 5, 6, sometimes 7 page scenes where I'm pretty much doing all of the talking and the drive. And so I think, all right, well, how am I going to keep this alive for the audience? I'm basically telling them everything they already know, except for one clue. So how do I make the recreation? The writers call it the gotcha scene. How do we make that um, fresh? And so I start with that. And what I've discovered is in order for me to learn the lines, I kind of have to do what Elsbeth does, which is recreate the murder as I'm talking about it. So it ended up being like a gift that Elsbeth gets into the mind and the world of the murder, and that helps me internalize and physicalize how I'm going to perform it. So it ended up being this wonderful blend.
Does it also help with kind of absorbing the way that she's processing and the way that she's kind of going through all of it, with the fact that she likes to reenact things as well? So you have that physical way to absorb it into your body at the same time.
Yes, exactly. You're exactly right. What I was discovering was it is something that Elsbeth embodies, and then she also gets inside the emotions of the person and somehow can understand and have this empathy in a way for these pretty horrible people. It doesn't mean she's not going to bring them to justice. Like even in season 2, the episode where Jordana Brewster played an escort, high-end escort, and she basically performs euthanasia on, this man that he was her client, but she also loved him. And so Elsbeth really, I think, more than any other episode, completely understands the love that this woman has. She's not going to let her have a pass, because her ultimate goal is, of course, to find justice and bring justice to the world and right some of the wrongs of her past, because she has defended some pretty horrible people in her past.
There's also a lot in terms of how she uses the way that other people perceive her in order to read people. We see a lot of characters that, are very dismissive of her and really try to push her out of their space. And, she'll just kind of keep coming into the space and keep using that to really figure out
Yeah.
details and clues. And was it important to you that she always did have that self-awareness of how people are kind of sometimes pushing back on her and pushing her out of their spaces in that way?
Yes, I mean, ultimately, she is who she is. She's not it's not a Machiavellian or manipulative thing that she's doing. However, she does know, because she's such a highly perceptive person, how people receive her. And sometimes it hurts, when she sees, oh, that person is underestimating me, or that person thinks I'm silly or dumb or whatever. But it doesn't deter, as a matter of fact, she digs in deeper and says, oh, okay, that's going to be their fatal flaw. And so she knows, when she is tweaking a situation in her favor. She knows when she wears polka dots, stripes, a bucket hat, a bird jewel. She knows when she has all of these things, it's a distraction for people so that she can throw them off their game. All that said, she dresses that way because it makes her happy. She loves that. You know what I mean? She dresses to make herself feel joyful and positive.
And you were mentioning the costumes, but there's also that great detail of the fact that she's always laden not just with one huge bag, but multiple bags. And
Yeah,
so it kind of creates this physical comedy every single space that she walks into. From your
right.
perception, what is it that makes her feel comfortable in just kind of physically having all of those items and all of those objects on her? Because we saw the episode where she pulled everything out and she didn't even really know what was in them.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I've always said that the bags are like a crutch or security blanket. They're a way to make her feel armed, that she's ready for whatever is coming her way. And so she puts things in the bag that she thinks she might need that day, that week, for whatever the case is that she's working on, or just life stuff. And so it makes her feel very secure, I think, to have all those bags. The price to pay is that they're physically cumbersome. But she doesn't care that, she's going to trip sometimes, or they're going to fall, or she's not going to be able to find something. It's the fact of emotionally needing all of those things. But then, and I've talked about this before, I don't know if you've noticed, but when I go in to have that gotcha scene, the mission exposition, the bags are gone. I no longer need them. It's now just down to what's in my brain.
Oh my gosh, I hadn't noticed that, but now that you said that, I'm like playing back scenes and I can see it in my mind. I love it. There's also this great gift of playing this character over so much time where you kind of described earlier as getting to find her and then refine her constantly. Because
Yeah,
if you look back to when we first met her on The Good Wife, she mentioned having a son, but it wasn't even by name and there weren't really those details. And now we get to see all these fleshed out details with her son Teddy. And
right.
so what has been that space for you of getting to take all these little tiny details that you had over the years and then getting
Yeah.
to look at how are you coloring it in and how are you fleshing it out?
Well, in the case of Teddy, I was really nervous about bringing this person in because we spent so much time talking about him. And if you harken back to Columbo, he talked about his wife all the time, but we never met his wife. And there was something really mysterious and interesting about that. And so I was worried that, we would open up the magic box and it wouldn't be what the writers or the audience or even Elsbeth had imagined in her mind or their minds about who this person is. Luckily, our showrunner John Tollins was like, "No, we're going to bring him in. It's going to deepen the character, Elsbeth. It's going to give her so much more dimension. We can't deprive the audience of this." And so I was like, "Okay, I totally trust him." And then we found Ben Levi Ross, who plays him, and it was just perfect. That thing where what's on the page, what's in our minds lines up with the person that walks in the room. And then there was just no doubt in my mind after that, because I had the flesh, the person in the flesh, and the way that the writers, John Tollins and the writers were creating the character on the page was so great. It was against what you would think. Like the impulse would be to make him, highly quirky or in some way, butt up against his mom, but they love each other, but they have conflict, but they do love each other. So it's a lot richer than I could have dreamt. And so I feel that way about everything where we've taken a detail from the past and the writers have fleshed it out and it has turned into something that I couldn't have even imagined. But that's just, I really trust our team and our writers. And I know that the skill that they have far surpasses mine. I'm there to, elevate and serve what they've put down on the page in the best way that I can.
There was also the episode with the psychic that started seeing something about Elspeth's mother and really was talking about the idea that her mother was someone that always encouraged her to be so fully herself and to be bold and to be colorful. And you could see the truthfulness and the emotional response of everything that you're saying is actually accurate. And I was curious if that aligned with some of the things that you had envisioned for, how Elspeth grew up, how she was raised in the past, or things that you talked about with Robert and Michelle King in the past.
Right, right. We didn't in the Good Wife and Good Fight discuss much about her, her parents or her in the psychic episode with the brilliant Tracy Ullman. It's actually the grandmother that we're talking about, which I think was like a really wonderful tidbit that I didn't know that we were going there until I read it on the page, and I was so moved by that description, and it made me, of course, think about my own grandparents. And so I was able to really key into some of my own history there when we were playing that scene. And as a matter of fact, just a little interesting story, the day that we were going to shoot that scene where I had to give that monologue, my mother out of nowhere sent me a photo and said, look what I found in the attic. And there was these dolls that my grandmother had made us when we were kids. I hadn't seen these in, 40 years or something. And it was almost like my grandmother was with me when I was doing that scene. But that's just, acting when you connect with your own personal history and bring it to the character. The character, we didn't have a prescriptive kind of, this is how she grew up. This is what, like, I didn't even know it was Peoria. We knew I grew up somewhere probably in Illinois, but we didn't know that until we got into the writer's room. And so I feel like I'm discovering the history of the character. I'm like on an episode of Finding Your Roots every time.
There's also been an aspect of Elspeth always coming across as someone who really trusts her gut and is very confident in her skill set, her intelligence, and her abilities. But we kind of see how, because she comes in with a slightly different rhythm, it takes people a second to cotton on. And the beginning of season 1 was very much the police force around her getting used to that and realizing actually she's a genius and she knows exactly what she's doing here, and we should utilize that more. And I loved the conversation in the Matthew Broderick episode where she mentioned, oh, the police are listening to me more and more, and you can kind of see her settling in. And what are some of the evolutions that you've kind of found in the confidence of, I've always trusted myself, but actually now I have a team around me who not only believe in me, but really, really support me?
Yeah, no, I think one of the greatest things about this iteration of the character is it's a story now about a woman who's reinventing herself in, the second half of her life. She had this whole life in this other place doing these other things. And now here she is in this new situation with these new people around her, alone. I mean, at first anyway, Teddy doesn't even live, doesn't live in New York. She is not married, she's not dating anyone. And there's just something very wonderful and refreshing and quite radical, really, about seeing that, on network TV, to be frank. And so I love that about it, that we're seeing her find herself and we're seeing her find her confidence. we're also seeing her find and connect to and be okay with her vulnerability, saying when, hey, I'm wrong, and saying, oh, I'm being too, I'm being meddling too much, or I'm trying to control too much, or, I'm I'm trying to be someone's friend who really needs to kind of be on their own, or, just things like that, that really I find are the most fun things to play. But also it shows how blessed we are to be in a situation where we can have such a long, slow, and interesting arc in the evolution of the character and her blossoming in this part of her life.
I love that. And, you've previously described how the work on this show and the things that the writing asks you to do with this character has really allowed you to stretch yourself in a lot of ways and to sharpen yourself creatively. And I was interested in what are some of the changes that you've kind of found within yourself from going outside of your comfort zone and being asked to do so many new things with her.
I mean, a lot of it just has to do with the amount of material I'm trusted with. It's more than I've ever been trusted with in a television show. And so finding a way to keep that fresh for myself and also for the character, going in and making sure that I'm not just making the same choice over and over again. Sometimes I'll do a scene and then I'll go, oh my gosh, was that the character? Am I still the character? And I'll say to the director, was that still the character? Because I worry now that I've been doing it so much that it's now second nature. And is there more? Am I bringing too much of who I am as a person to the character? Am I losing so finding the balance, because there is something to like, but hopefully I think the audience likes seeing the way this woman thinks and moves and does, and the creative freedom to do a bit. I call them Elsbeths. And I'll say, I'm going to do an Elsbeth here, and I'll do it. And sometimes it makes the cut and sometimes it doesn't. But for me, the character, the comedy in the playing of the character is so much a part of the DNA that I want to make sure that I always honor that and keep that in there, while at the same time, knowing that this is a show about murder. I mean, it is a drama with comedic, undertones and overtones. So it's all about that, finding the balance. And that has been what has, been so refreshing and challenging and stretched me in such a great way.
She's such a great character and was always so memorable throughout the Good universe over those years. And so it's been really wonderful to get to see her so fleshed out. So congratulations on everything with this new season, Carrie, and thank you
Thank,
so much.
thank you for having me.